April 30, 1975, hours before the fall of Saigon, the last helicopter lifts off from the roof of the American embassy. On board are the final American diplomats and military personnel remaining in Vietnam. Below, crowds of Vietnamese desperately try to board the helicopters. Some feel betrayed by the Americans who had promised to help them but were now leaving them behind. This image would leave a deep scar in America's collective memory, becoming the symbol of an empire's first real defeat. A document preserved in Pentagon archives details the war's ultimate cost: 58,220 American soldiers dead, 303,644 wounded, and expenses totaling $150 billion in 1975 dollars, equivalent to $4 trillion today. But beyond the numbers, Vietnam's true cost ran deeper: a nation's shaken confidence, the collapse of the American invincibility myth, and deepening social divisions. Henry Kissinger, among the first to use the term Vietnam Syndrome, would later write, "What America lost in Vietnam wasn't just a war, but its confidence in itself." At a military base north of Caracas, the Venezuelan army deploys new S-300 missile systems. The systems will provide deterrence against potential American airstrikes. That same day in Washington, the National Security Council holds an emergency meeting about the situation in Venezuela. In the blue waters of the Caribbean Sea, an American aircraft carrier task force patrols. While the official explanation is ensuring regional stability, everyone knows this is a show of force directed at Venezuela. Following recent clashes in the disputed Essequibo region, tensions are rising along the Venezuela-Guyana border. Venezuela has clearly stated its intention to take control of the oil fields in the region. The United Nations has called for restraint from all parties, but certain circles in Washington are demanding a tougher response. According to a partially declassified Pentagon assessment report, Venezuela's military capacity is limited. However, the same report notes that the Bolivarian militia forces in Caracas draw direct inspiration from the Viet Cong guerrillas in Vietnam and are adapting similar tactics to urban environments. Richard Holden, a former CIA analyst and Latin America expert, says during a television program, a potential intervention in Venezuela could be far more dangerous than Vietnam. In Vietnam, there were forests and rice paddies. In Caracas, there are concrete labyrinths and millions of urban militants. A report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington calculates the cost of a potential intervention in Venezuela: $100 million per day, $36 billion annually. And this assumes everything goes according to plan. In Vietnam, nothing went according to plan. Jack Thompson, president of the Vietnam Veterans Association, says in an interview, "Vietnam's greatest lesson was understanding the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. The cost of repeating the same mistake in Venezuela could be much higher." In Vietnam, America's strategic goal was to stop the spread of communism. In Venezuela, while the official rhetoric speaks of supporting democracy and ensuring regional stability, some believe the true motivation is access to the world's largest oil reserves. If the similarities between Vietnam and Venezuela are so striking, what are the differences, and how might these differences affect the outcome of a potential intervention? The first and most important difference is the global context. The Vietnam War took place at the height of the Cold War. The US-Soviet rivalry created proxy wars around the world. In today's world, America is no longer the sole superpower. China and Russia take a much more open stance against American interventions, especially in regions they consider their backyard. In the last decade, both China and Russia have developed close relationships with Venezuela. Most of the Venezuelan military's modern weapon systems come from Russia. Economic development projects and infrastructure investments largely come from China. This creates a dynamic very different from the Vietnam era. In Vietnam, China supported North Vietnam, but avoided direct intervention, says international relations expert Dr. Sarah Jones. Today it's much harder to predict how China and Russia would respond to a crisis in Venezuela. The second important difference lies in domestic political dynamics. The Vietnam War initially had strong support from the American public. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, this support rapidly eroded. The Tet Offensive in 1968 marked a turning point that dramatically changed how Americans viewed the war. Today, American society is already deeply divided. Even initial support for a Venezuelan intervention is questionable. Polls show that 68% of Americans don't want to enter another foreign war. During Vietnam, social opposition grew gradually, says a political scientist. Today, thanks to social media and instant information flow, we can expect opposition to a Venezuelan intervention to be much faster and more intense. The third difference is the economic context. The Vietnam War took place when America was at its economic peak. Today, America is struggling with a national debt exceeding $34 trillion. The federal budget deficit is at record levels, and economists warn about the economic consequences of entering a new military adventure. The Vietnam War placed a heavy burden on the American economy and contributed to the dollar crisis, says economist Michael Peterson. Today, the U.S. economy is much more fragile. A long-term military operation in Venezuela could pose a serious risk to economic stability. The fourth and perhaps most important difference is the resistance capacity of Venezuelans. In the Vietnam War, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong had the experience of decades of anti-colonial struggle. They had fought first the Japanese, then the French, perfecting guerrilla tactics. While Venezuela's Bolivarian militias don't have such war experience, they study the lessons of Vietnam and Cuba's guerrilla warfare experience. Moreover, modern technology and social media offer new possibilities for asymmetric resistance. In the slums of Caracas, militias train regularly. They read books by Vietnam veterans, learning how to adapt their tactics to urban environments. In Vietnam, forests provided natural protection for guerrillas, says a militia trainer. In Caracas, buildings, metro tunnels, and complex street networks can provide similar protection. The bitter lessons learned in Vietnam have been incorporated into military doctrine. However, a fundamental question remains unanswered. Is it possible for a superpower to win a long-term asymmetric conflict against a much weaker but determined enemy? In Vietnam, America won almost every military encounter. Even the Tet Offensive was tactically an American victory. But strategically, it lost the war. It lost the war of will, the war of patience. At a White House security meeting, a general who is a Vietnam veteran says, "The most important lesson we learned in Vietnam was that not every military problem has a military solution. Some conflicts should be resolved at the table, not on the battlefield." In Congress, the costs and risks of a Venezuelan intervention are being debated. A senator who is a Vietnam veteran says, "Before accepting the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, no one predicted that 58,000 American soldiers would die. If we make the same mistake in Venezuela, the consequences could be even more devastating." American diplomats are working intensely to resolve the crisis. However, some circles in Washington continue to emphasize the Venezuelan threat. Ironically, the Vietnam War was an experience that changed America's approach to foreign interventions. This condition, known as the Vietnam Syndrome, created caution in American foreign policy. However, the syndrome's effect diminished over time, and America embarked on new interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the Venezuela crisis will test how much America has learned from Vietnam. Will painful experiences lead to a wiser approach, or will history repeat itself? As Santayana said, a historian notes, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." There are many lessons to be learned from Vietnam. Hopefully this time, these lessons will be learned. For a nation still feeling the bitter toll of Vietnam, could Venezuela be a repetition of the same mistake? From the Gulf of Tonkin to the Caribbean Sea, will history repeat itself? In the corridors of the Pentagon, a quote hangs framed on a wall: "There are no unwinnable wars, only unwinnable wars that are too costly." Vietnam's cost was heavy. Venezuela's might be even heavier. In August 1964, the USS Maddox encountered North Vietnamese torpedo boats while patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. Although it would later emerge that the second attack never actually occurred, this incident led to the adoption of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson the authority needed for full intervention in Vietnam. In less than a week, both the House of Representatives and the Senate overwhelmingly approved this resolution. Now, some analysts question whether the conflicts in the Essequibo region could create a similar pretext for intervention in Venezuela. Guyana has strong ties with the US and UK. Venezuela receives support from Russia and China. Could a small border conflict escalate into an international crisis? Professor Emily Wright, an international law expert from Yale University, says as in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, facts can be easily manipulated. Today, technologies like social media and deepfakes make such manipulations both easier and harder. Easier because content creation is simple, harder because verification mechanisms have also improved. The Essequibo region covers approximately 160,000 kilometers square. Though sparsely populated, it contains rich oil deposits. ExxonMobil and other Western companies have made major discoveries in the area. Venezuela has long considered this region its own territory. Following a referendum in December 2023, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro strengthened his sovereignty claims over the region. The slogan "Essequibo is Venezuela" adorns the walls of government buildings in Caracas. In the Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh's greatest weapon was popular support. This support allowed Viet Cong guerrillas to move like fish in water among the local population, neutralizing the superior firepower and technology of the American army. What about the situation in Venezuela? Does the Maduro administration have full popular support? The situation in Venezuela is much more complex, says an anthropologist studying Venezuela. Maduro has supporters, especially in poor neighborhoods and rural areas, but there's also strong opposition. In Caracas's El Valle neighborhood, 72-year-old Maria Gonzalez says, "I supported Chavez, and I supported Maduro for a while too, but now everything is so expensive we can't find medicine. Still, I don't want Americans to invade our country." The economic crisis in Venezuela has dramatically worsened people's living conditions. Hyperinflation, chronic shortages of goods, and the collapse of the healthcare system have caused millions of Venezuelans to leave the country. In 2018, Venezuela's inflation exceeded 1,000,000%. Market shelves were empty, and even basic medications couldn't be found in hospitals. These conditions strengthened the opposition. However, faced with the threat of foreign intervention, could Venezuelans unite? In Vietnam, the civil war between North and South became even more complex with foreign intervention. Could a similar dynamic unfold in Venezuela? The Vietnam War took place in an analog era. Guerrillas hid in forests and villages, communicating via radio. In today's world, resistance could take on a very different appearance. A potential conflict in Venezuela could be the first fully digital guerrilla war in history, says cybersecurity expert Dr. James Chen. Social media, cryptocurrency, drone technology, 3D printing, all of these can change the balance of power in an asymmetric war. On university campuses in Caracas, young hackers regularly conduct cyber warfare exercises. Their goal is to disrupt American military and intelligence networks in the event of a conflict. In Vietnam, Americans never expected the bamboo traps used against them, says a cybersecurity trainer. Today, digital traps can be much more lethal. Hacking a hospital or power grid can endanger thousands of lives. The Pentagon is aware of this threat. Cyber Command is training special teams for a potential Venezuelan operation. However, the difficulty of neutralizing a scattered and decentralized cyber resistance network is also acknowledged. Vietnam is also known as America's television war. For the first time, the horrific realities of war were broadcast live into American homes. This played a major role in the erosion of public support. Today, the media environment is much more complex. Social media, alternative news sources, deepfake technology, all these make perception management both easier and more difficult. In Vietnam, a journalist's or camera's access to the battlefield was limited, says media analyst Patricia Wilson. Today, every Venezuelan with a smartphone is a potential reporter. This takes the information war to a completely new level. The Venezuelan government has been developing social media strategies for years. Digital activist groups known as the Twitter Army actively work to defend government policies and discredit the opposition. On the American side, the State Department's Global Engagement Center conducts regular campaigns to correct misinformation about Venezuela. The Vietnam War was an ideological conflict, defending the free world against the threat of communism. In Venezuela, beneath the ideological rhetoric lies a struggle for oil. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves. With over 300 billion barrels of reserves, it surpasses even Saudi Arabia. However, most of this oil is heavy crude, difficult and expensive to process. Venezuelan oil is both an opportunity and a problem for the U.S., says energy analyst Robert Parker. On one hand, these reserves could contribute to America's energy security. On the other hand, production and refining processes could increase carbon emissions. Currently, Venezuela's oil production is at historically low levels. According to OPEC data, it's around 700,000 barrels per day, far below its potential. American sanctions, deals with China and Russia, technical challenges, and corruption have paralyzed the sector. One of the primary motivations for a potential intervention in Venezuela could be to take control of these oil reserves, says an energy security expert. However, as we learned from Vietnam, military victory doesn't always mean access to resources. Following the Vietnam War, a wave of refugees known as boat people emerged. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the country in primitive boats. A similar situation is already happening in Venezuela, but without a war. According to UN data, more than 7.7 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2015. This is the world's second-largest migration crisis after Syria. Neighboring Colombia hosts approximately 2.8 million Venezuelan refugees. Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and other Latin American countries have also accepted large numbers of refugees. A potential military intervention in Venezuela could make the current migration crisis much worse, says an official from the UN Refugee Agency. Millions more people might be forced to leave the country. In America, the status of migrants from Venezuela is a topic of political debate. Some politicians see them as lovers of freedom fleeing the Maduro regime, while others characterize them as a national security threat. Interestingly, some of the strongest objections to intervention in Venezuela come from Vietnam veterans. They say they believed similar claims a generation ago and experienced the consequences bitterly. "When I went to Vietnam in 1965, I believed I was there for a purpose," says 78-year-old Vietnam veteran Robert Miller. "We were going to stop communism, defend democracy, but what I saw there showed me that reality was very different from what was described in propaganda books." The Vietnam Veterans Peace Organization has called on Congress to prevent any military intervention in Venezuela. "The mistakes of one generation should not be repeated by another," says the organization's president. The Vietnam War was part of the Cold War. The US and Soviet Union fought through proxies without directly confronting each other. Today we see a similar dynamic in Venezuela, but in a more complex way. Russia provides modern weapon systems to Venezuela and sends military advisors. In 2018, two Tu-160 strategic bombers conducted exercises in Venezuela, the first appearance of Russian nuclear bombers in the Caribbean. China has signed credit agreements worth $62 billion with Venezuela. Most of these loans are repaid with oil deliveries. China has also developed satellite technology for Venezuela and modernized its telecommunications infrastructure. Venezuela has become a new front in global power competition, says geopolitics expert Dr. Michael Lee from Columbia University. During Vietnam, one pole of the world was communist, the other capitalist. Today the balance of power is much more complex and fluid. The Vietnam War deeply divided American society. Anti-war protests spread from university campuses across the entire country. The killing of 4 students at Kent State University brought tensions to a peak. Today America is already divided. Partisanship has reached levels not seen since the Civil War. A potential intervention in Venezuela could deepen this division even further. Right now it seems unlikely that there could be a Pearl Harbor moment or a 9/11 effect that could unite the country, says a political scientist. Intervention in Venezuela would likely be a policy enthusiastically supported by one side and vehemently opposed by the other. America's internal division also affects the foreign policy-making process. Congress is more reluctant than before to grant war powers to the president. The biggest constitutional lesson from Vietnam was the limitation of the president's war powers, says a law professor. Since Vietnam, America has embarked on many military adventures: Grenada, Panama, Iraq, twice, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. While it's said that lessons were learned from each, the full application of these lessons is questionable. When Saigon fell in 1975, we said never again, says retired General James Harris. Then we repeated similar mistakes in Iraq. In Afghanistan, we again saw the limits of the nation-building project. Now, will we make the same mistakes in Venezuela? Military historian Dr. Elaine Roberts explains. Each new generation of generals and politicians acts with the belief that this time will be different. Our technology is better, our intelligence is stronger, our strategy is smarter, but the fundamental dynamics of asymmetric warfare don't change. The White House says it's trying to use diplomatic channels to resolve the Venezuelan crisis. However, relations with the Maduro administration have been severed since 2019. The U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the interim president, but Guaidó's support within the country remained limited. The situation in Venezuela shows the limits of U.S. diplomatic tools, says a diplomatic expert. Sanctions, isolation, supporting the opposition. None of these strategies were sufficient for regime change. The Venezuelan crisis has also taken on a regional dimension. Colombia, Brazil, and other Latin American countries adopt different approaches. Some support the U.S.'s tough stance, while others call for dialogue and reconciliation. Latin American countries don't want to witness another U.S. intervention on their continent, says Latin America expert Professor Elena Martinez. Panama, Grenada, the Dominican Republic. The region has painful memories of U.S. interventions. Planners at the Pentagon are working on various scenarios for Venezuela. These range from limited airstrikes to a full-scale invasion. However, each scenario is shaped in the shadow of the bitter lessons learned in Vietnam. An operation targeting Venezuela would have to be very different from Vietnam, says a retired admiral. Urban warfare, digital resistance, global public opinion reaction, all of these must be taken into account. Military analysts list the challenges an American operation in Venezuela might face. Caracas, with a population of more than 2 million, is a complex city. Slums, narrow streets, steep hills, all these create an ideal environment for urban warfare. Instead of the forests in Vietnam, there are concrete labyrinths. The Venezuelan army's modern Russian air defense systems could limit American air superiority. In Vietnam, North Vietnam's Soviet-made SAMs led to the downing of hundreds of American aircraft. The Bolivarian Militias are a civilian force trained in guerrilla tactics in addition to the regular army. Their numbers are said to reach 2 million. Like the Viet Cong in Vietnam, these militias can disappear among the population. Venezuela's oil infrastructure is the country's most valuable asset. However, this infrastructure is also its most vulnerable point. In the event of a conflict, damage to oil facilities could disrupt global energy markets. The oil fields in the Orinoco Belt contain the world's largest heavy oil reserves. However, special technology and large investments are needed to extract and process this oil. Control of Venezuelan oil is not just an economic issue, but also a geopolitical one, says energy security expert Dr. Carlos Rodriguez. Control of these reserves could change global energy balances. American oil companies were expelled from Venezuela years ago or forced to work under restricted conditions. ExxonMobil, Chevron, and other companies lost billions of dollars in investments. In an intervention scenario, the return of these companies could be on the agenda. The current humanitarian crisis in Venezuela could worsen with a potential military conflict. Access to food, medicine, and basic services is already restricted. Millions of people are struggling with malnutrition and health problems. A conflict could completely collapse the already fragile infrastructure, says a humanitarian aid expert. Power outages, water problems, food shortages, all of these could increase exponentially. During the Vietnam War, civilian casualties and displacements were among the most tragic aspects of the war. Napalm bombings, the use of Agent Orange, and the evacuation of villages ruined the lives of millions of Vietnamese. Today, although international law and media oversight are stronger, the impact of a Venezuelan conflict on civilians could be devastating. The country has already seen more than 7 million people migrate. A conflict could multiply this number many times over. Vietnam was a war where journalists could move relatively freely. American reporters could go to the front lines, follow soldiers, and report facts directly. This freedom played a critical role in bringing the realities of war into American homes. In Vietnam, we learned the power of media, says journalism professor Martin Clark. Since then, the Pentagon has tightly controlled media access. In the Gulf War, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, journalists worked with the embedded system. In Venezuela, international media already operates in a limited environment. The Maduro administration has suppressed critical journalism, shut down opposition media organizations, and expelled foreign journalists. A Venezuelan conflict could be history's first social media war, says a media analyst. Raw footage from thousands of smartphones could replace official narratives. The Vietnam War took place in a gray area of international law. The U.S. claimed it was helping South Vietnam against communist aggression without formally declaring war. Today, the international legal framework is much more developed. The UN Charter emphasizes respect for states' territorial integrity and avoiding the threat of force. Intervention in a country's internal affairs is seen as a clear violation of international law. The U.S. could use humanitarian grounds or protecting democracy arguments for intervention in Venezuela, says international law professor David Williams. However, such justifications are met with skepticism by a large part of the international community. The Vietnam War created waves of protest worldwide. Paris, London, Rome, Tokyo. Thousands of people took to the streets demanding America's withdrawal from Vietnam. Can a similar reaction be expected for Venezuela? Absolutely, says an activist. Today, global solidarity networks are much stronger. Social media facilitates coordination of protests and information sharing. The Vietnam War left deep marks on America's collective psyche. The term Vietnam Syndrome expresses not only caution in foreign policy, but also a national trauma. Soldiers returning from Vietnam were often seen not as heroes, but as part of a problematic war, says military psychologist Dr. Jennifer Adams. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and didn't receive adequate support. Today, the U.S. military is more conscious about soldiers' mental health. However, an asymmetric war in an urban environment could create different types of psychological challenges. Urban warfare makes the distinction between friend and foe even more difficult, says a military psychiatrist. The line between civilians and militants becomes blurred. This can increase the risk of moral injury in soldiers. Vietnam and Venezuela are two conflicts separate in time and space. However, the parallels between them highlight the importance of learning from history. Santayana's words are more valid today than ever, says a historian. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The Vietnam War was a turning point in America's history, a moment when its myths were shattered and it confronted its limitations. Could Venezuela be a similar moment? In the corridors of the Pentagon, a framed map of Vietnam hangs on a wall, serving as a silent reminder. Under the map, these words are written: "The greatest lesson of history is that people do not learn from history." Have policymakers in Washington truly learned the lessons of Vietnam? Or, From the Gulf of Tonkin to the Caribbean Sea, will history repeat itself? In the slums of Caracas, an old man listens to his radio. He has watched documentaries and read books about the Vietnam War. If the Americans come here, he says, they will be in for a much bigger surprise than in Vietnam. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong won the war despite America's superior technology and firepower because they were prepared to endure longer. General Vo Nguyen Giap knew that the Americans wouldn't stay in Vietnam permanently, that they would leave sooner or later. His strategy was simple: endure until American public support eroded. Could a similar dynamic be seen in Venezuela? Definitely, says a strategic analyst. The Maduro regime has endured economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and internal opposition for years. They are experienced in patience and resilience. Americans generally expect quick results. Vietnam showed the dangers of this expectation. Short-term tactical successes don't guarantee long-term strategic victory. If America intervenes in Venezuela, says a military historian, it might have a plan for the first weeks or months. But what happens after 5 years, after 10 years? In Vietnam, we didn't have an answer to this question. The Vietnam War forever changed how America views itself. The myth of American invincibility was shattered, replaced by a more humble national consciousness, aware of its limitations. Was this change permanent? The experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan give a complex answer to this question. America fell into similar traps in these conflicts: the challenges of urban guerrilla warfare, the cost of nation-building in an unstable country, the failure to understand complex cultural and religious dynamics. Now the Venezuelan crisis could test whether America has truly learned these lessons. On the road from the Gulf of Tonkin to Caracas, will history repeat itself, or will a different path be taken this time? In Congress, an elderly senator approaches the podium, a Vietnam veteran. Deep lines mark his face. Half a century ago, he says, we entered a war built on a lie. 58,000 young Americans lost their lives. Millions of Vietnamese died. And what was the result? Saigon fell. The communists won. Now are we thinking of repeating the same mistake in Venezuela? The chamber falls silent. Everyone contemplates whether a tragedy from half a century ago might repeat itself today. From the Gulf of Tonkin to the Caribbean Sea, does history move in a cycle? Has America learned the lessons of the past, or must each new generation experience the same mistakes? The Venezuelan crisis will be a test to answer these questions. Can diplomacy and patience win, or will guns once again do the talking? In the corridors of the Pentagon, a quote hangs framed on a wall: "There are no unwinnable wars, only unwinnable wars that are too costly." Vietnam's cost was heavy. Venezuela's might be even heavier.